Without further ado, please welcome our panelists.
Okay, thank you so much, Valerie and the Bush School. It's truly a delight to be here today and to be introducing and moderating this excellent panel. So I hope you've got a lot of energy and questions prepared after lunch. So I'm delighted to be here, and also it's wonderful to be the second Australian here up on stage. So Brad, thank you for opening that up. And just a special note to Valerie also to say how grateful I am to be here, also with my husband and my son, who many of you have also met. Yes, the youngest scholar amongst us. After many of you might know that Valerie was on a Fulbright Research Fellowship in Australia last year, and people in Australia, amongst government and outside of government, are still talking about the presentations that she gave at Australia's first Women in International Security Conference at the Australian National University, and also when we hosted her in Melbourne at the Monash Gender Peace and Security Centre. So I just wanted to, amongst this community, to acknowledge that, and your scholarship ideas and warmth still continue to have an impact. So thank you for reciprocating here. Okay. Okay, all right, fantastic. So we're here today to explore the question of how does elevating the status of women and girls advance US foreign policy objectives, including prosperity, stability, and security. And Valerie asked panelists to introduce themselves very, very briefly, and I don't want to take much time doing that before I introduce our fantastic panel. So I'm a Fulbright scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School this year, and I'm exploring how to create the first Institute for Feminist Foreign Affairs in Australia for the Asia Pacific region. So anyone who wants to talk about that, we can talk about that after. To increase the roles of women in foreign policy and national decision making in the region, and also to elevate women's rights as part of those discussions. So obviously entirely relevant to the discussions we're going to be having today. And I've worked on women, peace and security issues around the last decade. Both in government and outside of government, and particularly from the first drafting of Australia's National Action Plan, in government and civil society through its monitoring and implementation. And so I'd be happy to talk to anyone further about that as well. And before I introduce our fantastic speakers, I just want to reflect on, I've been reflecting since Jamie's fantastic opening about the importance of stories in our work to influence, but also to make these issues that we work on real and relevant to our panel today. I was remembering a moment when I had just joined the Australian Agency for International Development, so the USAID equivalent in Australia, and in the gender equality team, and I was preparing some briefs for my bosses at the time, who were going to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York and also having meetings in Washington, DC. And it was just after the creation of the role that Milan Verveer first sat in, the Ambassador at Large on Global Women's Issues. And this was a very exciting moment. And for a very small gender equality team in Australia in the aid program and the equivalent State Department, it was a big hook that we could advance our issues on top of. And had the fun task of preparing some of those briefs and the meetings that would happen in Washington, DC, to lead, with the intention to lead to Australia having that kind of role. And the year later, that role was created, and Australia now has its third ambassador for women and girls. So I share that example just, I guess, to highlight how influential some of these ideas are. And one of the themes of this symposium today is these connections about the domestic and national and international, and we'll hear about that more this afternoon as well, and how these ideas travel. So we might be talking about US foreign policy, but this also has big implications around the world as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our brilliant panel here, who've all made it on time. So To my left, firstly, I have Rachel Vogelstein. And so Rachel is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow and Director of the Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and a Professor of Gender and US Foreign Policy at Georgetown Law School, which is a pretty fantastic title, I have to say. And Rachel's research is focused on the relationship between women's advancement and prosperity, stability, and security. From 2017 to 2018, Rachel was a visiting fellow at the Centre for Global Legal Challenges at Yale Law School, where she taught a seminar on women's issues in US foreign policy and national security. And from 2015 to 16, Rachel served as senior advisor on women's issues for the Hillary for America campaign, developing domestic and global policy. She's served as an advisor to the Clinton-Kaine transition team and is an attorney by training with expertise on gender equality and lectures widely on these issues. To Rachel's left, I have Jamille Bigio, and Jamille is a senior fellow at the Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, and in the Obama administration, Jamille served as Director for Human Rights and Gender on the White House National Security staff. She also advised the White House Council on Women and Girls in its international priorities, and the First Lady Michelle Obama on adolescent girls' education and the Let the Girls Learn initiative from 2019 to 2019 into the future. I have a crystal ball. 2009 to 2013, Jamille served as senior advisor to the US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues within the Office of the US Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, and she was also detailed to the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and to the US mission to the African Union. And further to the left, we have Gayle Tzemach, Lemmon, who is an adjunct senior fellow also at the Women and Foreign Policy Program and author of New York Times bestsellers Ashley's War, the untold story of a team of women soldiers on the special ops battlefield, and the dressmaker of Khair Khana, about a young entrepreneur who supported her community under the Taliban. Ashley's War is currently being developed into a major motion picture, so I'm sure you can fill us in on what we can look forward to there. And her next book for Penguin Press is set in northeastern Syria and focuses on what ISIS has left in its wake there, the most radical experiment in women's equality in the world's least likely place, and will be published in early 2020. And Gayle began writing about entrepreneurship in conflict and post-conflict zones while studying her MBA at Harvard, following a decade covering politics at the ABC News political unit. And just to say, if you Google any of our fantastic panelists' names, you will see how widely written and the kind of commentary that they give, there would be pages long, that they give on all of the issues that we're going to address today. So firstly, Rachel, we're going to talk to you, who's going to introduce and explore a range of issues that the Council on Foreign Relations Women and Foreign Policy Program have been working on. And to start off with, I guess, a broad question to open it up, if you could tell us about, in 2018, what the status of women looks like around the world.
Absolutely. I know we're going to each take a turn, so why don't I present that? I'll respond to your question. First, thank you, first of all, Sarah, for your very kind introduction and for the work that you're doing. I look forward to when your institute opens. I hope we'll be able to visit and exchange scholarship. I also want to say what a pleasure it is to be here at the Bush School and thank Dr. Valerie Hudson for your leadership on women, peace, and security and for assembling this fantastic symposium today. It's a pleasure to be a part of it. At the Council on Foreign Relations, the Women and Foreign Policy Program analyzes how elevating the status of women and girls advances U.S. foreign policy objectives. So to respond to Sarah's question, I'll briefly speak to three issues. The first is, what is the status of women and girls in this moment? And then second, importantly, why does the status of women and girls matter to U.S. foreign policy interests? And third, if it does matter, which I submit that it does, what is it that the U.S. foreign policy apparatus can actually do to advance that priority? So let's begin by exploring the status of women and girls. There are many experts in the room who can speak to where we are at this moment, but I'll start with perhaps a radical proposition, which is that there has never been a better time in history in which to be born female. So I know what you all may be thinking, particularly at this moment, and considering the newspaper headlines you're liable to see any given day, certainly with respect to the Me Too movement and the number of stories that we've heard around the world about abuse and sexual assault, violence, issues like women subject to rape used as a tool of war in the DRC, mothers who die from largely preventable conditions related to pregnancy and childbirth in sub-Saharan Africa. There are so many examples on any given day when we open the newspaper or read the headlines where we see practices that speak to deeply embedded norms and attitudes that are seemingly intractable. So one could also question with headlines like these how it could possibly be that there's never been a better time in history in which to be born female. But at the council, we actually conducted a data-driven review of the past 20 years to evaluate the status of women and girls, and found that the pace of change that we've seen demonstrates that these issues are not, in fact, intractable, and that we can make remarkable progress in a relatively short period of time. So I'll date this review back about 20 years to the 1995 UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, where women's rights are human rights became a rallying cry heard around the world, and where 189 nations adopted an ambitious platform for action that called for the full and equal participation of women in political, civil, economic, social, and cultural life. Since that time, we've seen remarkable progress with respect to advancing the status of women through legal frameworks and institutions. You, I'm sure, referenced this morning UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which came to be during this time period. We've seen a record number of countries put laws prohibiting violence against women or discrimination on the books. In fact, the number of countries with laws prohibiting domestic violence rose from just 3 in 1989, shortly before the Beijing conference, to 127 by 2015. We've seen multilateral institutions elevate the rights of women in important ways, certainly the UN, institutions like the World Bank and the IMF tackle investing in women as engines of economic growth as core priorities. So these are really significant policy shifts over that time period. And we've also seen concrete progress in a few key sectors that suggest that we can change outcomes with respect to gender equality when we set collective goals and promote accountability, and importantly, dedicate sufficient resources. And I'll mention two. The first is women's health. The rate of maternal mortality, which previously was 500,000 women every year, essentially was cut in half over 2 decades. Now, that is not to suggest there isn't more work to do, but that's a remarkable change over a 20-year period. Or consider education, where we saw the gender gap at the primary level virtually close on in the aggregate on a global level over a 20-year time period, meaning that there's now an entire generation of girls that are entitled to schooling that their mothers and grandmothers were not. So again, I don't want to overstate the progress in any of these areas. There's still much work to be done on women's health, where over 200 million women lack access to modern methods of contraception, or in education, where we know the gender gap persists at the secondary level. But while there's more work to do, what these gains show us is that we can and have made significant progress on issues that are often seen as so deeply rooted that they're intractable. And that helps explain why there's never been a better time in history in which to be born female. Our research also shows, however, that there are still significant gaps, and there are 3 areas in particular that I'll highlight that all relate to, I think, the work ahead of us with respect to US foreign policy and gender equality. The first issue is economic participation, which is an issue that has dominated headlines, particularly in conjunction with the Me Too movement and the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace. And while that scourge is certainly pervasive, that really represents just one part of the problem. 2 decades after the Beijing conference, we know that the highest echelons of the economic sphere remain largely male. And despite the gains in girls' education, we've actually seen women's labor force participation drop from 57% to 55% globally over this time period, despite the really strong evidence we have that women's economic participation grows economies. And of course, there's a gender wage gap that persists in every country in the world for which we have recorded data, including, of course, here in the United States. So a lot of work that remains to be done on women's economic participation. The issue of political participation is another where we've seen far too little progress. 20 years after Beijing, women continue to be underrepresented in almost every country in the world, filling less than a quarter of parliamentary seats worldwide. And we've seen the number of countries with a female head of state rise from 12 in 1995 to about 20 today. So given that we're living in a world with 193 UN member states, that's not exactly progress to write home about. And we certainly have great expectations, not just in terms of the representation of women in Congress, which could change tomorrow here in the United States, but we've started to see changes in countries around the world where more women are willing to run and to raise their voices and to seek political office, but the gap really remains significant. And finally, women have made too little progress in the area of security, which we could look at on 2 dimensions. Certainly, we can think about that with respect to women's participation in peace and security processes, and we could also think about that with respect to personal security or freedom from violence. So now that it's many years since the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, we know that only 2 women have ever led a government negotiation in a formal peace process, Miriam Corona Ferrer of the Philippines and Tzipi Livni of Israel. We see that strategies to counter violent extremism still overlook the role that women can play in combating radicalization, as well as the role that women play when they have been radicalized. And we know that on a personal level, violence against women continues to be an epidemic, and certainly the Me Too movement has put words behind many of the numbers that we've seen. So what can we take away in 2018 to Sarah's question? First, that while gender inequalities are certainly deeply rooted, they are not insurmountable, and that we can make progress over a short period of time, and that is what we've seen with respect to health and education and legal rights for women. But despite this progress, considerable unfinished business remains, particularly in the area of economic participation, political participation, and security. So why does this unfinished business matter? That is also the work of the Women in Foreign Policy program at CFR. And we have offered the following proposition, which will be my second today, which is that advancing the rights of women and girls through U.S. foreign policy is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And I certainly don't want to minimize the power of the moral argument and the rallying cry that we heard in Beijing that women's rights are human rights. But while that cultural shift that took 50 years to take place from the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Beijing Women's Conference, from seeing violence against women as cultural to then seeing it as criminal, from viewing women's rights as ancillary to human rights to viewing them as fundamental human rights. As important as that moral and human rights-based case is, it's not the only reason to care about gender equality. And in fact, in the 21st century world we live in, the moral case simply may not be, and often is not, convincing enough to leaders to put this issue of gender equality high on the foreign policy agenda. But today, that is not the only argument we have at our disposal, because we have a strong body of evidence that demonstrates that promoting gender equality advances critical U.S. foreign policy interests, including prosperity, stability, and peace. So first, consider the issue of economic growth. Leading financial institutions and international economic institutions, corporations in the private sector have all concluded that when women participate in the economy, poverty goes down and GDP goes up. And we have a new interactive report that I commend to all of you that actually helps visualize the percent of GDP that we would gain globally, regionally, and nationally if we simply close the gap between women and men in the labor force. The global number is actually 28 trillion. So to put that another way, we would gain about 26% of annual global gross domestic product if we simply close the gap between men and women in the workforce by 2025. So think about that at a time where we have seen political unrest following an economic downturn. We have literally left trillions of dollars of economic potential on the table. And we see that leading economists recognize this principle now. The World Economic Forum, for example, which is not exactly considered a bastion of feminist theory, puts out an annual gender gap report that actually shows that when the gap between men and women in a given country on economic participation and political participation is smaller, that those countries are more economically prosperous and secure. So the relationship between gender equality and economic prosperity is quite clear and it's quite strong. And you've discussed this morning the evidence of the relationship between gender equality and stability. And there are so many scholars in this room who've written about the relationship there, the studies that show that women's participation in peace agreements makes them 64% less likely to fail and about 35% more likely to last at least 15 years, which is an incredibly important finding in an era that is characterized by recidivism in conflict. So the bottom line is that women not only bring unique and critical perspectives to the table, but also that including women in economic policy, in security policy, can actually improve outcomes for everyone. So if that is the case, what is it that the US government can actually do to elevate gender equality around the world? Well, my colleagues will talk in greater detail about their experiences working on policy on women, peace, and security, and certainly in working with women on the front lines in conflict situations. But it's important to recognize that we now have an entire policy framework that supports these theories that, if it is implemented, could improve security and economic outcomes for all of us. We've seen one emblem of the shift in the US national security strategy, which now over several administrations, the Clinton administration through the Bush and the Obama administration, and even in the most recent national security strategy that we've seen in the Trump administration, explicitly recognizes the importance of women's rights and empowerment to stability and security. And we've seen leaders from Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to Condoleezza Rice to Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and beyond, all take steps to embed this philosophy in policy changes. Even the existence of an Office of Global Women's Issues itself, the position that Sarah referenced earlier, actually began in the Clinton administration, and that office was then elevated during the Bush administration and elevated further still and made permanent by executive order during the Obama administration and continues today. And we have representatives who've served in that office here today, suggest that these issues are recognized in ways that they weren't before. Clearly, there's still a lot of work to do to implement those policies, just as there's certainly a lot of work still to do to elevate the status and rights of women around the world. But I think when we take a longer view, it's quite remarkable to see the changes that have taken place over this 20-year period, not only in women's lives, but also with respect to US foreign policy. So I think the evidence is certainly in that in the 21st century, no nation can get ahead if half of its population is left behind. And while there are plenty of skeptics out there, I think at this point we see changes not just from advocates for women's rights, but we're seeing changes from leaders around the world. Certainly Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, a conservative leader in a traditional society, has embraced policies to increase women's labor force participation as a key pillar of his economic growth strategy. We can debate the degree to which those changes have made a significant difference in Japan, but the fact of that leader taking those steps is quite significant. The UN Special Envoy in Syria, Staffan de Mistura, appointing an advisory group of women to inform the tenuous peace process there. Again, we'll hear from Gayle. Certainly there's a lot more work to be done, but the fact that that process exists is significant. Even the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia announcing an ambitious economic modernization effort known as Saudi Vision 2030, which resulted in the rescission of the female driving ban last year. That in and of itself was a recognition that as the Saudi economy continues to struggle with low oil prices, that in a country where women earn half of all college and graduate degrees, that we simply cannot put women's economic potential to the side if economies are going to grow. And that is why we need to continue to reinforce how important these issues are with the current administration and continue to make the case to muster the political will to implement the policies that are on the books and to grow the financial resources to advance programs and policies that implement gender equality as a fundamental pillar of U.S. foreign policy objectives. So I'll stop there and answer to your question and turn it to my colleagues to talk more about their experiences in policy and on the ground.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. One thing, just before I invite Jamille up, in addition to your radical propositions for us today, some might think they're radical, so some may not. One theme for the symposium today that also drew out, I think, was the intersections between human security and national security, and also one contribution, big contribution, if I could say, that the program that you've been running and working for at the Council on Foreign Relations has done is to draw out a number of issues that others might not see as national security issues around child marriage, issues around inclusive economies, and inclusive economies in conflict and fragile settings, that these are actually issues of national security and of interest of US foreign policy as well. And so that there's a quote actually in the symposium introduction, an outline that says, national security and human security must proceed hand in hand for peace to be durable and just, including issues that some might not see normally in the scope of national security, such as education, health, and welfare. So I think you brought that out in a really clear way that perhaps might, I guess, lead to some questions after. So thank you so much, Rachel. And now, Jamille, I have a very big question for you to build on Rachel's discussion, focusing in on women's peace and security initiatives. What does the Council on Foreign Relations research tell us about these issues?
That's great, thank you. I'm going to come up here so I can share some of our products with you all as well. So I'll, of course, echo the thanks to Sarah, to Valerie, to the whole team, to you all. So thrilled to have this opportunity to share some of our research with you. That's our research.
Boots on the ground.
Yeah,
exactly right. Boots on the ground. There you go.
Cowboy boots on the ground. Yeah.
So I had the pleasure of working in the U.S. government when we took the decision to draft the first U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. So of having the role at the State Department, at the Defense Department, and then at the White House on the National Security Council staff of first developing that first strategy and then of overseeing its implementation. And I now have the joy of being in a think tank role, where now we get to develop research and recommendations to try to deliver some ideas to the US government, to other governments, to the UN and others, to help continue to drive and to draw on what our lessons are of seeing what are the challenges in the process of translating the policy into action. So the research that we've done has focused on a few areas. So we've looked at women's participation, how women's participation improves outcomes before, during, and after conflict. We've looked at conflict-related sexual violence and framing it as a security issue and understanding it as both a war crime, crime against humanity, a significant human rights violation, but understanding its implications to security and what the responsibilities are of the national security community to therefore respond to it. We've looked at peacekeeping, understanding as there's a response by the US government and others to try to push for greater peacekeeping reform, how does that intersect with women's participation? What role do female peacekeepers have? And how does that intersect with the responsibilities of peacekeepers to protect civilians, including from conflict-related sexual violence? And our final focus area has been on violent extremism and of understanding women's diverse roles as perpetrators, as mitigators, as victims, and how that's part and parcel of violent extremist strategy. And it is to our detriment that it is not yet part and parcel of counter-extremist, counter-terrorist policy. So what we have tried to do is to lay out the evidence for those for whom it will convince, and to lay out what does the picture look like now, and ideas of what policymakers can do. So let me first show a digital interactive that we have produced with the support of the Compton Foundation. We're so excited about this, to focus on the participation side. And here, we're making the case that that given the fact that countries around the world are struggling with recurrent armed conflicts, expanded terrorist and extremist networks, record levels of mass displacement, things aren't working. Our current strategies are not solving the problems. We see that 90% of civil wars in the 2000s occurred in countries that had already experienced civil war during the previous 30 years, for example. And that nearly half of the peace agreements forged in the 90s failed within 5 years, just as some examples of that the current approaches weren't working, and so that new thinking is needed. Retired General John Allen, former commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, former special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to Counter ISIS, recalled at one of our events when he told former Afghan President Hamid Karzai that no society has successfully transitioned from being a conflict-ridden society to a developing society or better unless women were part of the mainstream of that society, unless they were empowered at the household level, empowered in society to fully contribute. This perspective was shared by Ala Morabit, who's a Libyan activist, a UN advisor, a global leader, who reflected that it should not have taken ISIS using women as a recruitment tool for us to say, wait, women have agency in conflict, we need to be using them on the other side. And yet these are some of the voices that we have now that are leading the charge to make the case that women need to have a role, have a seat at the table, whatever the decision-making table is, to influence and inform peace and security processes. So, do they? So one of the things that we've done with this interactive is we're tracking the numbers of women at the table in peace negotiations. As a starting point, we can all agree that's not the full story. We can also agree that that is part of the story, that are there no women at the table as the peace negotiation is being worked out? Are there 3% of women, or are there 30% of women? And we see dramatic differences in the process and in the agreements that are worked out and what happens afterwards based on those numbers. So in our Explore the Data tab, I just want to show you this interactive, but really I encourage you all to to explore it on your own time, because we've gone through peace processes, and you can see one by one, what are the numbers, how have they changed over time, how has that influenced other pieces of the agreement. So this is all there. Take your time to explore. We've laid out why it matters. So they're kind of documenting in national security terms how women contribute to peace processes and to security efforts when they have that opportunity. So just to speak through a few of those pieces, we see, for example, how women access critical information. And we have case studies as well that you can see there, but it was the recognition that women can access critical information that led the United States and coalition partners to form teams to increase our outreach to Afghan women, and in Iraq before that to Iraqi women, and gather intelligence about security risks. Sadly, sometimes there's warnings still go unheeded. So there's many examples where networks of women activists reported suspicions, for example, in one instance that Taliban was smuggling weapons into the province and security officials ignored them. And a few months later, the Taliban led the largest prison break in years. So we've at least gone to the place of recognizing that sometimes they have access to this information, and next step is now acting on those warnings. But we've also documented ways in which women have negotiated local ceasefires. So I know you're kind of scanning through. I just wanted to be able to show you where some of this information is so that you can explore it on your own. But Syrian women, for example, during the years of the war there, have successfully negotiated cessation of hostilities between armed actors in several areas to allow for the passage of aid. They have pressured militias to accept ceasefires to be able, again, to allow that access, to demand the release of detainees. One activist recounted that when a group of armed fighters entered their village, the men couldn't go outside because they would have been shot or abducted, but in the end it was the women who surrounded the fighters and drove them out of the village, that they were able to play on kind of the gender norms in society, that there were areas that they could go and roles that they could play. We've documented here, and again, you can explore ways in which women are viewed as honest brokers. More women's groups have organized mass action campaigns in support of peace deals than any other social group in recent period. Women broaden the agenda at the negotiating table, raising issues like political and legal reform, social economic recovery priorities, transitional justice concerns, issues that help societies reconcile and recover and can make agreements more durable when they are part of those agreements and are things that society responds to. This is one of the stories that former USAID Deputy Administrator Don Steiberg tells of his time as an ambassador in Angola, where he was tasked with trying to help maintain the peace accord there. And he'll talk about how they didn't consult women. And so, for example, they didn't demine the areas where women went to collect water. So women were some of the most significant early victims of the mines after the conflict, because no one asked them where they went and what their roles were and where the mines were. And later, when there was a threat of the agreement breaking, and there was a big push of suddenly wanting to get civil society support to help keep the parties in the agreement, that there wasn't those broad networks, there wasn't that broad support because they hadn't they hadn't engaged civil society, they hadn't kind of looked at what their concerns were at the outset. So there's lessons there for us. One of the things that we're really excited about is the research tab, where I know earlier we talked about how engaging women at the table is both the right thing to do, and that the human rights argument is what resonates for some, but for those for whom they need to make the operational effectiveness argument, what we've done here is collected peer-reviewed articles and leading research documenting the ways in which women's participation contributes to security outcomes. So we've looked at, in each of these, and you can click on one just to give an example, we've pulled together some of the research and the citations so that you can then dig into what those more specific studies show. So we've looked at how parties are more likely to reach sustainable peace agreements, how women's participation strengthens the security sector, if you scroll down, looking at the ways in which women contribute to the security actors, how countries are more prosperous and stable as the gender gap closes. So what the relationship is between women's political participation and stability, between women's participation in post-conflict recovery, for example. And then we've looked at how gender inequality and violence against women increase the risk of instability. So here, citing some of Valerie Hudson's research, for example, as well as in other places in this, that terrorism risks rise when women are less empowered, that support for gender inequality is associated with likelihood of violence, and how sexual violence in conflict fuels instability. So again, I really hope that you take some time to explore more of this, but this is just one of the products that we've developed that we wanted to share. And as a think tank, we also advise Congress, so we've drawn on this research and made the case why women's participation matters to security outcomes. We helped to get 7 new amendments introduced into the last National Defense Authorization Act negotiations. One of them made it into the report, so we're hoping next year that more will actually make it into the authorization itself. And Olivia, shared earlier the funding that that we were able to get into the appropriations process, and some of that is building on the research that's been done by experts in the audience here and others that help make the case that allies in government, in Congress, and other places can then take to make the case to others. Because that's, I think, one of the lessons that we see now, that there are allies everywhere, on both sides of the aisle, in the House, in the Senate, in the White House, in the State Department, at the UN, really at NATO, that want to do more to promote the role of women, peace, and security, to understand gender and security issues, and are looking for, one, how can they make the case to others? And two, now what can they concretely do to shift the formula, to shift what's happening now? So there we've, I'll share another example of the work that we've done that connects to that, and here's looking at peacekeeping. So there's been, for a long time now, a target that countries have agreed to, that it's time to increase the number of female peacekeepers that are deployed. That, as we see in how women contribute to security outcomes, they also contribute to peacekeeping outcomes. I interviewed Canadian Lieutenant Colonel Tara Willis, who joined the military in hopes of deploying as a peacekeeper, and she shared her stories as a peacekeeper in South Sudan, and the ways in which it was actually the men in her unit who reported to her the difference that they saw when she deployed with them, of what they were able to do because she was part of their units. So they reported to her that where villagers have seen armed men in uniform in South Sudan, it's both government and opposition alike, sadly, have perpetrated atrocities. So when peacekeepers, more armed men in uniform, came into the village, villagers were not open to them. They were wary, and it was the Lieutenant Colonel Tara Willis's presence that opened up space for the villagers, not just the women and children, but the men too, to share more information on what the villagers perceived as their security risks, which helped peacekeepers better fulfill their mandate of protecting civilians, and therefore fulfilling their broader UN mandate. Military generals with both the government and the opposition forces were also more transparent with Willis. So they shared more intelligence with her on everything from the size of their force to where they planned to go next. She wondered if it was because of her ability to listen or because of the general's own biases But either way, she found she was able to collect more information on the movements of the South Sudanese military and opposition forces than her male counterparts. She was also able to facilitate her own unit's movement as they sought to deliver life-saving food and medicine. So was able to negotiate their way through military checkpoints that her commanders were reporting were checkpoints that they had been stuck at and turned away from. And I share this is just an individual's experiences. This is Willis's experience, but it's backed up by research that has been published in peer-reviewed journals and other places that we've documented in one of our new reports, and some of it's here in our website, that echoes that her experience is one that we've heard from women in uniform around the world, and is part of kind of the growing research of understanding how women improve mission effectiveness. And there's a policy opportunity right now. So there's been this long-standing promise to double the number of women deployed as female peacekeepers. Troop contributing and police contributing countries, some are interested in that. They have pointed to the fact that there are not enough women in their peacekeeping pipeline, meaning there aren't enough women already serving in their armed forces or police forces to deploy in the first place. Now, we'll give them that there should be more, and we can support them in recruiting and retaining more women in those security forces. But the fact is that countries are deploying fewer, at percentage level, fewer women are in their deployments to peacekeepers than are in their national forces. So the story is not just about are the women there, it's about are they being given the opportunity. So Canada's launched a big initiative to try to explore what kind of incentives could be used to encourage police and troop contributing countries to deploy more women. And we're about to have a round of briefings with the US government to encourage them to join in that effort. And that's one of the things that, I guess with our kind of think tank role now of being able to make that case to the Canadians, to the UN, to the US government, that as the Trump administration pushes for peacekeeping reform, pushes for peacekeeping units to be more effective, that those goals would be advanced by having more female peacekeepers deployed. I'll just note quickly, kind of on the other areas of research that we're doing, it's looking at conflict-related sexual violence, as I mentioned. We all hopefully saw the Nobel Peace Prize announcements most recently. So exciting for them to acknowledge two courageous leaders, Nadia Murad and Dr. Dennis Mukwege, on the fight against sexual violence and armed conflict. One more voice reinforcing the idea that sexual violence is a peace and security issue. And there, again, there's so much more that can be done by security sector actors to address sexual violence in conflict, whether it's increased training, increased attention to accountability, resource gaps. But right now, it's still, in terms of many responses, it's treated as kind of a one-off human rights issue in practice in terms of where actually the money goes, who's actually at the table talking about it. It's not yet kind of in the heart of the national security conversation. And the same pattern holds when it comes to violent extremism too. That again, as I said before, that we see more women being radicalized, we see women on the front lines countering radicalization messages. They're there, and yet, and you know, on the radicalization side, they're taking advantage of security loopholes of not having female police who can do body searches of women. So extremist groups recognize that they can therefore send more female suicide bombers who may be able to slip through security checks. And certainly this has become, sadly, a calling card of Boko Haram in Nigeria, who are using more and more female suicide attackers, have used a number already this year. And again, that's not yet driving the investment in really thinking about how do we increase the recruitment and retention of women in national security forces, how do we engage women as partners in countering violent extremism. So what we're doing now is putting the evidence together, finding where the policy opportunities are with the US government, with Congress, and as I said, there are many. I've been working with a congressional office who's developing legislation on women in CT, CVE now that they hope to introduce in the next few months. And so there are a lot of levers that are moving. There's a fragility bill in Congress that is looking at conflict prevention broadly and is open to understanding where does gender fit in that, and kind of adding more language there on how women contribute to conflict prevention. And so part of kind of the effort is both integrating it into finding where the windows are to keep processes, to keep this all moving. And I'll just close with the UN Secretary General just addressed the Security Council a few weeks ago at the open debate on women, peace, and security, where this year I think over 90 countries gathered there. Very exciting. He cited our research on the number of women who are at the table. But he also made a call that I think is something of kind of captures, I think, a little bit of where we are. So he said that every year we make laudable commitments in the council at these annual debates. Again, 90 countries this year spoke and made commitments, but they're not backed with the requisite financial and political support. We repeat statistics about the sustainability of inclusive peace processes, but this is not how we mediate most conflicts. We extol the influence of women peace builders, but provide little space for their participation. We rely heavily on women's organizations, but do not fund them adequately. And we recognize the importance of gender analysis, but cut the budgets for such expertise. So I think they're recognizing where the rhetorics are. We're now at a space where many are making the laudable commitments, more and more people know the data about the sustainability of inclusive peace processes, but that there's still that gap of translating that into action, of making sure that the financial and political support are behind it. So I think that's where the role we're trying to serve at our program, and I know many of the experts at this table, of now really finding those opportunities to translate these commitments into the financial and political support needed to actually make sure that women have a seat at the table and that our peace and security processes are better off for them.
Thank you so much, Jamille. I think that's a very powerful reminder that actually we can find allies everywhere. Yeah. if we look for them who want to do more. I think perhaps, Valerie, we can send out to all the conference participants and all the students here some of the links to the interactives, because they are truly fantastic resources, and you can go into country case studies and follow a lot of different paths there. And just lastly, something just to that came to mind following Jamie's presentation this morning, and thinking about who narrates the world. I think these stories, there's a lot of data here, but that data is also very powerful stories, and I think contributes to the stories that we are all building, and how we want to influence.
That's right, and I think we have case studies. We have 10, 12 case studies there about conflicts both ongoing and in the past. And back to what Jamie was saying, that men have been rewriting the history of what happened in conflicts and in peace processes and what role women played in them. And so what we're trying to do is just contribute to the documentation of the ways in which women are making meaningful security contributions in countries around the world that aren't being given attention, and they're doing it with very little international support, if any. And so it's both critical to document it and to have this as something that we can draw on when we're making the case for the US government and others to invest in women's organizations, to recognize how much of a backbone they are, especially at the local level. And Gayle has seen this up close, to contributing to the peace and security, local security efforts. And there's not enough attention to that yet. So.